Carolyn doesn't need much introduction, but I did ask her to tell us about her academic quals. And Carolyn is Professor Emerita in Veg Management at UNE and is the acting chair of the New South Wales Threatened Species Scientific Committee. So Carolyn has been interested in the ecology of plant populations in changing environments, and over the last 40 years she has studied the hatch, match and dispatch of populations using the lens of a plant reproductive biologist. And she's acknowledging her co-author, David McKay. Is that K?
Mackay.
Spelling mistake. Mackay. So Carolyn's going to talk to us about 3 decades of monitoring the endangered daisy, Olearia flocktoniae, lessons from a pioneer species.
Thanks,
Thank
Kath.
you, Carolyn.
And of course, all questions can go to David at the end of the presentation. So when I first joined UNE in 1994, I had some sage advice from Professor Peter Jarman, who is our foundation professor, newly minted, and he encouraged me to take on some long-term studies in the area, and of course that's what a tenured job provides. It provides you with that job security to go and do that. So in 1994 we took up the data set from national parks, who'd studied, I think began studying it in 1988, the population biology of Olearia flocktoniae, the Dorrigo daisy, the infamous Dorrigo daisy. And our work concentrated on the demography, seed longevity, some work on the genetic diversity, but I can talk about that later. That really was thrown out a bit by the polyploidy, and also disturbance regimes. And so today what I want to talk about is what we've really learnt from that 10 years on, if you like, and I have a sort of drastic idea of how we should go forward with future monitoring of it. So it was first collected in March 1909 on the Dorrigo Plateau by Borman, a famous collector of the time, and Maiden named the species for his favourite, Miss Margaret Flockton, who was a botanical illustrator at the Gardens. And then it wasn't collected again until 1984, by John Williams at that time in Old Karamba Road, and it was thought that it had gone extinct in that period, and I don't think that's likely to be the case. I just think it's likely that it was missed in the landscape because it's just another one of those daisies in the pioneer environment and was easily overlooked. But the most, what we came to learn with this species is that some of the most difficult aspects with managing it are when you have got something that's so highly restricted. It's got a very small area of occupancy, it's federally and state listed, but the species had a real PR problem. There was deliberate and accidental destruction of plants and at the sites. No one wanted to have a threatened species on their property in this Dorrigo district. They would deliberately put down pasture to exclude germination events in the species. And so we really required, and it was successful to the most extent, inter-agency cooperation between parks and forestry of the day. And some of the other challenges, of course, is with sampling and experimental issues with endangered species. Field workers need to be able to actually tell it apart from other daisies that grow in these same pioneer environments, and that's been a bit of a challenge. Not to mention, trying to sample something that's rare in the landscape. I often get asked, what was its natural sort of footprint in the area? And of course we don't know that. We don't have any information of how it and where it occurred in the landscape pre-European. But it's likely that it did take advantage of cleared area from fires and also from landslips on the Great Dividing Range, which are largely full of weeds now, and so there's not that many opportunities for it to naturally come up, and it comes up in forestry operations and alongside roads. So understanding of some of these difficult things includes trying to work out what the spatial scale is required to keep the species in the landscape. It's the frequency of disturbance events and the intensity of the disturbance events, and ensuring a minimum number of populations exist in the landscape. This is very, very difficult with a quicksilver species that comes and goes. And of course, in trying to make sure that the genetic integrity of the species is not compromised by these continual bottlenecking events. So here we can see some evidence of deliberate destruction with the tire marks over some individuals, but also early attempts by forestry to get road workers to understand that there was a rare plant species along the roadside. So it hasn't always been a difficult species to work with in that regard. We did have a lot of interest in keeping it above ground. So as I mentioned, making sure we get the disturbance regime right. So here, on this graph here, this is a graph of the mean population size of plants in the populations on the far left x-axis, and on the right y-axis, are the number of populations. And over the span of when we've been surveying it, it's been known to have occurred across 105 different locations, but at any one time, you're not likely to find it in more than, I think the most was 45 populations, and it's down to 9 at the moment. You can see there's a lot of waxing and waning happening with this species. It correlates with there being a lot of disturbance activities over the landscape at particular time periods. Land transferred from forestry operations into national parks, and so the disturbance regimes changed. There was no active disturbance in a lot of these locations, and so it disappeared from many sites. You can see that in 2020 there was something happened then, didn't it? They were all basically from one population, private forestry operation in the Dundurban area. I think we had something like 17,000 recruits just in one site. It was amazing. And that private forestry operation is one of the strongholds for the species at this point in time. So I just want to step back and just look a bit about some of the experiments that we conducted on this species. One of the things we want to know is something about seed longevity. So what we did in March 96 is we gathered enough seed from 5 populations across the range so that we could annually germinate batches of seeds to work out something about the longevity of this species. And as you can see, we used the most exclusive seed tagging equipment known to science at the time. We screened these seeds annually. And what you can see from this is that it looks like it's got a pretty healthy longevity spectrum. So some years, I think the variability here is due to the UNE glass houses, but you can get around up to 70% germination occurring. Now, the proportion that hasn't germinated, we exhumed them, and they were rotten. So we weren't missing a proportion that had gone into some sort of dormancy state. So this looks good, doesn't it? From an ex situ point of view, looks like we've got quite a good story here with seed longevity. At the same time, again, you can see some very fancy field equipment in operation here, not to mention the family car. We took soil samples from 22 sites. 10 of these sites, the daisy was present above ground, and 12 sites, each with year 1, 2, 4 and 5, where there may have been covert populations underground, but certainly above ground it was extinct. And we took all this soil back to the greenhouses and placed them out on trays. We knew how to germinate this thing, so we just spread the soil out on vermiculite and counted the number of germinates that came up. So what you can see here, in contrast to the previous slide, is that by year 5 you've got nothing left in this soil seed bank. So this is talking about the site conditions, and we know from other work that that humidity and very wet conditions erode the chances for the seed bank to stay for the future. So this work was pretty important. The other work that we did was using some more sophisticated equipment, a D9 bulldozer, and we took that through Chalundi Road with the help of forestry to clear up the road and to look at what kind of response we would get in the population if we turned it over. Now, we've learnt that it's really important to do this when the plants are above ground and still flowering at year 4, which is a really hard concept. You've got to knock over a threatened species, right? Not only do you do that, but you have to turn the soil over. It's no point just slashing it. You've actually got to really turn the soil over. And when you do that, what happens is that you see a resurgence in... Is this little thing working? Resurgence in the seedling profile, the blue band here after grading. So the proportion of the population, you can get a whole bunch of seedlings back after disturbance. But this is not sustainable, right? You can't be taking D9s through the landscape to do this all the time. From our paper, just stepping back in time, using elasticity analysis, which is a simple first step in answering important questions, it estimates the proportional change in the population growth rate for a proportional change in a vital rate. And it can be used to pinpoint those parts of a life history that we should focus on. And what we have found here is that the most of the important work that this work has shown is that the seed bank transitions are really important. And I think probably a better way of looking at this is with this figure, and just bear with me on this. If we have a disturbance event, we've got somewhere up to 30 days before things will germinate in the field, 3 to 6 months in the juvenile phase, 10 to 24 months before flowering really occurs. The seeds take about 2 weeks to develop into an infructescence on the daisy, and then 4 years to death of an individual generally. But the real sort of black box in this thing is what happens to all the seeds once they're dehisced, because on average you can get around about 15,000 seed deposited in a population in a season, but we're not seeing anything like that coming back in the subsequent years. And one of the things that we've noticed is that if there's a lot of rain, the fruiting heads here turn into soggy mops and the seeds are not dispersed at all. And also we feel that with the movement of the species away from the Great Dividing Range closer to places like Dundaraban, that the soil properties have changed from the original conditions, and perhaps there's more mould, fungus and so forth that's destroying the seeds in the seed bank. Okay, very good timing here. And so where we've got to with this now is we're down to look at 1997, at the beginning of it, and the progress for 2024. So we're down to 652 plants now, 113 adults, and in all years the range, it can range from 652 to just under 20,000, but this is not going to be sustainable to keep monitoring all of these populations every 2 years. We'd go out and look for go to every location we could get into to score this species, but depending on the disturbance regimes in a site, it's impossible to work out where one might find this. It's a pioneer of disturbed habitats. So where we've got to now, sort of moving forward, and after I've estimated that I think, probably about $1 million has been spent on this species. If you factor in all the in-kind and time and equipment and so forth, I don't believe we've really got this in a better position than when we first started. So what I think we should do now, and maybe just try it out for 5 years or so, is just stick to surveying the 3 key populations where we know it is easy to find, it turns over pretty well due to private forestry operations. We can also install disturbance at sites as well. It's doable. But develop an app where punters can record sightings of the species, upload photos so we can definitely agree that they've got the right taxon there, score the number of adults, juveniles and seedlings and the threats, and bring back recovery teams. All right, do you remember those? It's really important, I think, for species like this that we bring all of the knowledge together from scientists, the agencies, the local landowners to work on this species too, and others to bring them into a better position. So while we have good knowledge of the species, we also have a conservation-dependent species. And I think this is one where we should try a new strategy for the management of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. What a complex species in a complex environment. But I think we'll say here to the recovery planning team.